Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. The sexually violent murder of 21-year-old British student Meredith Kercher in Perugia, Italy, on the night of November 1st, 2007, became an international sensation when one of Kercher's housemates, 20-year-old Seattle native Amanda Knox, as well as her Italian boyfriend and a troubled local man Knox said she vaguely knew, was arrested and charged with the murder. Award-winning author and journalist Nina Burleigh investigated the murder, the controversial prosecution, the conviction, and 26-year sentence of Knox, the machinations of Italian justice, and the underground depravity and clash of cultures in one of central Italy's most beloved cities. When Perugia authorities concluded that the murder was part of a dark, twisted rite, a sex game, led by the American with an uncanny resemblance to Perugia's Madonna, they unleashed a media frenzy from Rome to London to New York and Seattle. The story drew an international cult obsessed with Foxy Knoxy, a pretty honor student on a junior year abroad, who either woke up one morning into a nightmare of superstition and misogyny, the dark side of Italy, or participated in something unspeakable. The Fatal Gift of Beauty is a compelling examination of an enduring mystery, an ancient storied place, and a disquieting facet of Italian culture, an obsession with female eroticism. It is also an acute window into the minds and personalities of the accused killers and of the conservative Italian magistrates striving to make sense of an inexplicable act of evil. Tonight's book that we are featuring is The Fatal Gift of Beauty, The Trials of Amanda Knox, with my special guest, Nina Burleigh. Thank you very much to agreeing to this program, and welcome to True Murder.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
And I apologize for some of the mispronunciation, and I'm sure that I did in doing that outline of the story. So you can correct us for the proper pronunciation.
Well, you did all right. The only thing you mispronounced was Perugia.
Perugia, there we go.
They don't pronounce the G, it's the G.
I knew that might be Perugia. Okay, well, I'll try to remember that for our interview here. So, Perugia, here we go.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first question I normally ask is, because I'm always curious, and I think the audience is as well, you're an award-winning journalist and author, but what about this story, or what brought you to this story? Give us the circumstances that involved you coming to the decision to write this story about Amanda Knox and her trials.
Well, I've been a journalist for a long time, a couple of decades, and I've done my share of crime stories. I was writing human interest stories at People magazine in 2008 when I read about this, and or when it happened in 2007, I was there, and it just intrigued me because I was looking for a project that would allow me to write about what happens to young women in this era, this day and age, post-feminist, young women who are just becoming independent, and how their lives go and what perils still lie in wait for them in our, supposedly equal gender era.
Right.
And that was one, and then the other was, it was happened in Italy, and I thought it would be kind of an interesting place to go. I had done a lot of two books before were in the Middle East, and one before that was in France. And so I felt I liked Italy, and I thought I wanted to go there and learn a bit more about it. And what I do with my books is, as in this one, The Fatal Gift of Beauty, about Amanda Knox, it's not just about Amanda Knox. You find a story that allows you to talk about other, larger, more the setting, more issues than just the tale. And so this isn't just a true crime book. It's not the police procedural book. It's really a story about a time and a place and a culture clash, and the history of Italy, the history of some of the superstitions that exist there, and really the Gothic side of Italy. People don't really think about. They think about Italy. They think about sunny Italy, and this is a Gothic tale. It happened the night after Halloween. It's a spooky story, and has a pretty simple, I think, explanation. But the tale that was woven, the narrative that was created by the prosecution and aided and abetted by the media, and believed in by the Italian public, and to a large extent by the British public, and to some extent by the United States public, is much more complicated, and it's almost impossible to explain it in an hour. And my assistant and I used to argue over it for hours when I was researching it, because there's so many kind of strange nooks and crannies and possibilities. And one guy who covered it for the British paper said watching the trial was like watching a tennis match, because every day you'd go in and you go, she's guilty. Oh, she's not guilty. She's guilty. She's not guilty. You know, it's like watching the ball bounce back and forth. Very, very complicated narrative. But anyway, ask me another question. That was a long answer.
I thought was interesting too is when you talk about that it's not your typical true crime book. It isn't, and it's more so you put everything in historical perspective, and there's an incredible amount of context to this too. So I right from the very beginning, you're reading the history. Well, I'll be asking you questions very shortly about the house itself and the history. So let's start with a little bit of that, because we have to set the stage here by telling the audience what Perugia, Italy, is known for, where it is geographically, so that people know, and historically, what is it known for. And in present day, what is it in practicality known for? So describe that.
Sure, okay. It's a beautiful walled mountain town in central Italy, in the region called Umbria, which is just under Tuscany. So it's like Tuscany, but it's kind of Tuscany's poorer cousin. It's landlocked. It's mountainous, not cliffs, not alpine mountainous, but tall, rolling mountains. Softly rolling mountains, I mean. And it's on one of these hills, and it's basically across a valley from Assisi, where St. Francis was born and raised and buried. And Assisi is this sort of religious, it's a pilgrimage point, really, for Catholics and for a lot of people who, St. Francis was kind of the original hippie in a way. Right. And so, but Perugia is like its historic rival in the Middle Ages, and it's the darker Assisi. It's literally darker. The stones with which it's made are darker, and it has this darker history of more intense kind of religiosity. The Templars, the Knights Templar, who were fighting the Crusades in the fighting order in Jerusalem, came back to Europe and became bankers to Europe for a while before they were run out of town by the Catholics. The Knights Templar, this was one of their stopping points, and they had a church there, and the Templars were alchemists. And they were sorcerers. They're associated with sorcery. So all the alchemists are associated with sorcery. Of course, alchemists are the original chemists, or alchemists are, the prior to modern day science, they were the scientists. So they were sorcerers in a way, and they have these weird signs and symbols, and they're all over the place in the town. The griffin is the town's, this sort of eagle lion creature.
Right.
Its significance is lost in the mists of time. It's pre-Christian, probably Babylonian. The griffin is the town symbol. And anyway, so the Perugia was settled originally by the Etruscans, so it's pre-Roman. The Etruscans were the sort of the spiritual base of the Roman Empire. Their language and it disappeared when the Romans conquered them, but their spiritual system lived on, and so that system of auguries, of looking at sheep and trails, that the Romans used, or looking at the way birds fly, like Caesar would have, when he was at Gaul, he would stop and say, the birds are going that way, that means I better not fight today. That's that nature-related kind of pagan, spirituality. That's Etruscan, and then the Romans took it over, and their gods were the Etruscan gods. That's Perugia, very ancient. Bricks, Etruscan bricks, and then Roman bricks, and then the Catholic, the Pope, the medieval era when the nobles ran it, and then the popes took it over from the 16th century onward, and really were crushing it, crushed its independence, and there was a lot of resistance to it, so they built this horrible giant dungeon on one side of it, the ruins of which are still there, and the Perugians produced some great artists. There's some amazing, Cinquecento art in the museums there, and the churches are beautiful. But now it's a university town. It's about 180,000 people, I think. I'm going to remember that, but it's around that many, and 40,000 of them are students. The University of Perugia is there, and a place called the University for Foreigners. And that is where Amanda Knox, University of Washington Junior, decided to go for her junior year abroad to study Italian. And that begins our murder story.
Now, before we get that, what was found interesting is that the Amanda Knox is going to Perugia, and there is a house that she has roommates, and there are there's some boys that rent an apartment, a 4-bedroom apartment in the basement, and they've been there for a while, years. Please tell us about what I found fascinating was you alluded to lots of the supernatural or the occult sort of background, I would guess, some of the history. But what's interesting is the 8 murders that happened in Perugia and the character of Perugia now, and which is embodied, or at least we can see with the story about the 8 prostitutes that the mafia. Tell us about that story. And
I forgot the one other aspect of the town that you're alluding to. It's very important. It's a student town now with a lot of conservative Catholics in the centro, in the beautiful center. But all of these towns, especially one this big because it's a regional headquarters, it has a suburban sprawl around it that goes all the way down the mountain and into the flats. And it's located in this sort of middle land between Albania and Rome. And it's an area where many criminal gangs have begun to operate in recent years. It's a crossroads for heroin trafficking because it's kind of less policed than Rome and Milan, and so these guys bring the stuff there on the train. There's a train that stops there, and the Albanians can get there pretty easily. It's also a place that they've got criminal gangs. They bring their prostitutes, they bring their human trafficking into Italy, and they bring these girls from Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. They bring these poor girls down there, and they train them basically in the area. And they're brutal, these men, and there were a few years ago, a girl turned up dead, nameless young woman in a sunflower field. They grow sunflowers around there. I mean, it's an unbelievably beautiful area. And this poor girl turns up dead, and they began an investigation, and they found that, there were a number of these girls had just disappeared, and they were just being killed because they would try to run away or objected to whatever it was that they were being made to do, and they were just being killed and thrown away like garbage. So there's this underbelly. And then when you go there, a tourist will go there and see this beautiful centro with this beautiful art and these unbelievably beautiful churches. but the locals know that there's another thing going on, and it's changed. It's and then they also had terrorism activities there, Muslim terrorism, where these guys were coming in using the University of Foreigners to get visas into Italy, and then they set up a kind of extremist mosque down also on the flats outside of town, and I think they were implicated in some. I don't know. I think the guy who shot the Pope actually went to school there. So it's got an underbelly, a dark underbelly, and there's crime there.
Now, one more thing before we get to the most important person probably in the story, Amanda Knox, and how she ended up in Italy and her history and her background, her family life. I found another interesting story early on in your book as well, where you talk about the history of the home that she rents a room in and is involved with, and you talk about the original owner and that it originally had something to do with the convent and nuns. And tell us a little bit about that and the discovery of bones. I found that another interesting part of the story.
Yeah, well, all of in a town like this, there's always history in all the buildings, and this building, a stone cottage, a farm cottage, had been there for hundreds of years, and most recently, before the current owner who was renting it to Amanda Knox and the company, the previous owner was a wealthy family that had owned it through World War II, and at the end of World War II, they were living in it, and they owned other properties, but they were living there because the children were going to school. It's a stone house on the kind of hanging on the edge of a ravine, almost at the very edge of the centro. So there's wilderness on one side, and then on the other side is the massive stone wall and the old Etruscan gate that, it's shadowy, giant gate, stone portal, really. And that's it looked out on this vista of Umbrian hills. And a beautiful place. And in the prior owners had lived there after World War II. They bought a property across the street that now is a parking lot, but at the time it was an orchard and had an old convent, an old cloister on it. And I interviewed the daughter of the owner, who's now in her 70s, the daughter of the previous owner, and she remembered being a little girl and going for the first time into this building and going higher and higher up the stairs and opening doors and cupboards, and they opened the cupboards at the top floor. They opened these cupboards, and she cried out, "Oh, Daddy, look at the dollies." And basically it was this cupboard stacked with infant skeletons. And what probably was going on is that, like many of these convents now, the stories that you hear are these nuns were pregnant, they're impregnated, and they give birth in there, and then the babies are, I don't know, or they were aborting them, or who knows. But these were babies that had died and were never baptized. Who knows what was going on? But in any case, this hair was standing up on my arms when she was telling me this, and then she said that the house, they felt the house was haunted. There had been mysterious violent acts that occurred there, hurt to them, and they left abruptly in the 40s and sold it to this guy who owned a little shop in town, and he bought it as an income property. So they didn't live in it. He and his wife owned it. Now his widow owns it. She's old, and she lives in Rome, and she just rents it to students through the real estate agency. So the owner never met the students who were there's a lot of student rental in the centro, and it's a big moneymaker for the town property owners.
Right. Now let's get to Amanda Knox. You talked about her parents, Kurt and Etta, and her life in Arbor Heights, Seattle. So tell us where they lived and what kind of neighborhood and what kind of upbringing Amanda Knox had with her parents. And her parents, her father had left, and then Etta had continued with a person named Chris Mellis. I may be mispronouncing his name. So tell us about Amanda's life growing up.
Oh, yeah, she was born in 1987. Her parents were Mom was a school teacher, Dad was an accountant. They were, young. The mother got pregnant before they got married. Kurt married her, and then pretty quickly after that, they were in their 20s, late 20s, he fell in love with someone else, and he left pregnant with a number 2 child, and so Amanda was like 2, and her dad left, and then she had a sister without a dad, and Etta lived with them alone for a while, and then married this guy, Chris Mellis, who was an IT specialist that she met on an 800 Microsoft helpline or something, very cute. And they lived in a small house in Arbor Heights, Seattle, which is it's a part of Seattle that's much more lower middle class than the rest of Seattle. Maybe it's where a lot of Mexicans and Samoans live. It's working class, right. And she lived there and grew up there. But she was a smart kid, and her mom, of course, was very hardworking and very into education. So her mom made sure that she got into the best prep school in Seattle, and she started shipping her into Seattle when she was in high school to the Seattle Prep, which is an upper-class school. So but in high school, Amanda, she'd been a soccer-playing kid, tomboy, and her dad had gone on to remarry, and they now had 2 more daughters. So there were 4 little girls. She was the oldest, and she was the one that could play catch with her dad, and her dad was like, he's a pretty manly guy, and she was the tomboy. She was the one who wanted to play catch with him, and she was a tough little soccer girl, and that's where the nickname Foxy Knoxy supposedly comes from. And then she went on to high school and became a thespian, kind of a theater geek. She was not attractive in high school. She was dumpy, dishwater blonde hair, kind of fat. And then freshman year in college, she just bloomed into this curvaceous, beautiful girl, and she's extremely photogenic. She's actually prettier in pictures than she is in real life, but she became pretty, and she had issues because her dad had never given her enough attention, and so she's one of these young women who was just really kind of trying to find her way with men, and had a great need for attention from them, and was somebody who really wasn't. She was still unformed as a person, and as a sexual person, really unformed, really kind of just not knowing what she was doing, but yet still becoming quite attractive to men. And meanwhile, she's also a good student, and she studied hard, and she was very good with languages. She worked really hard, had number of jobs. Was not a goof-off. People I talked to said, sure, she partied, but not hard. She wasn't a big college partier. She worked for the money to get herself sent off to Perugia. She did not do it with family. She had no family money, so she worked 3 jobs or something to scrape up the cash, and arranged for herself to go on this junior year abroad to Italy. And once she got there, she'd only been there a month when this horrible thing happened. And in the month that she was there, apparently, she cut kind of a wide swath in this little town because she's loud, she's athletic, she's oblivious to the way people kind of see her. I think she was acting out more than she was at home a little bit with guys, and didn't make a lot of she didn't make a lot of American friends. In fact, she tried to stay away from the Americans there because she wanted to practice her Italian. She's one of these people who just kind of had an intrepidness about her, and but showed up at class every day, wasn't goofing off. And a week before this murder occurred, she met a boy, a young man named Raffaele Sollecito, who was the son of a very wealthy doctor in southern Italy. And they started sleeping together from the night they met, and she spent every night at his apartment from that day forth for 7 nights until, well, more than that, because, 7 nights later there was a murder in her apartment. Her roommate was killed, and anyway, now we get to the murder, I guess.
Well, let's talk about Meredith Kercher. Tell us, she's from Britain, but tell us a little bit about her. She arrived before Amanda, so she was already in the apartment. Tell us a little bit about Meredith.
She did, yeah. Yeah, this poor girl is a little bit older than Amanda, maybe 6 months older or so, and fourth daughter, youngest child of a British journalist and his wife, who was Pakistani-born. So she's mixed race, beautiful, long black hair and dark eyes. And she, like Amanda, broken family. The parents were split up. Also hardworking, also kind of middle class. And she got herself sent to Perugia on what they call an Erasmus scholarship, which is something that's given to European students these days to kind of meld Europeans together. It's sort of like the Euro is, pan-European. They're trying to make students pan-European, so they have this program where they pluck you from where you live in one European country and you spend 6 months in another one. And, it's kind of like the Tower of Babel, because there are all these kids there who speak all different languages. But anyway, she was studying Italian. She went there, and she had some British friends, too, who were there. So she had a little community of girls that she hung out with. She got there about a month before Amanda, and she moved into this house. This house was rented by, the upstairs of the house was rented by 2 Italian girls who were older than them. And they put up a sign. They wanted some English speakers because they, Italians in this area don't speak English very well, and they wanted to practice it. So they took in the English girl, and they took in the American girl, who were almost the same age. And they thought, well, they'll get along with each other. We've done the right thing. And in the beginning, they did seem to get along together. They went out a lot. They would leave in the same time in the morning. They would go to their classes. They would come back. They would go out party at night around 10 o'clock. They'd hit the bars. And so they were buddies. And then they weren't. Or if they were, they started to sort of not spend as much time together. And that kind of rift was discussed only after Amanda Knox was arrested. So in other words, nobody was saying, oh, they didn't get along before when the body was found and they were trying to, the police were interrogating people and talking to their friends. Nobody pointed out that there was something weird about Amanda Knox or that Meredith didn't like her until after Amanda was arrested. And we could see that in the records of the investigation.
Now, tell us a little bit. We should get to the murder and discuss that, because really this is about the trials and of Amanda Knox. But there are 4 boys in the basement, college boys, Marco, Giacomo, Stefano, and Riccardo. And Riccardo later is quite important to the story. Well, they all are. But tell us about those 4 boys. There's talk about they grew a little bit of pot. They had an LSD poster. They're important to this story, too. Tell us just a little bit about those 4 college boys, Italian college boys.
Well, they're Italians. They're from, they're as you said, they were growing pot plants. One of them was a musician, had his own band, and he ended up being Meredith Kercher's lover for a couple of weeks before she was killed. Some stories, some say that Amanda had a crush on him, and at some point, but obviously she had a boyfriend soon afterwards. But they would have parties in their house. They would take the girls out to bars, and they would smoke. They would get hash and booze and have these, college kid type parties night after night, I think. And the girls, whenever they wanted to party, would just go downstairs. And there was the scene. And there were people drifting in and out of that apartment at all times. And one of those people who was drifting in and out happened to be this guy named Rudy Gade, who was an African immigrant son from Ivory Coast, and he was not a student. He had not even graduated from high school, poor guy, but he was trying to pretend like he was a part of that community. Strange character and strange life story, but he was hanging about, and yeah, so that's the story of the house. The boys downstairs, girls upstairs.
Now, tell us just, I think it's important to the story that he was also considered the Baron, this Rudy, but also tell us, according to the boys in the basement, who brought who was he a friend of to end up at the home at this apartment building with the women and the men? Who brought him there in the first place?
Well, nobody really knows. I mean, they're doped up, and these kids are doped up. They have no idea. They're just sitting in a room, and all of a sudden there's somebody sitting there. I mean, it's never been explained how he got there the first time. He he was playing basketball. There's a basketball court nearby, and he was a basketball player from high school on. He played basketball with them, and I think they just knew him. The guys knew him. Probably they knew him from partying on the steps of a Duomo or discos. I mean, it's a pretty small town, and people all knew each other. Plus, he only lived about 4 blocks away, and he liked to drift around and hang out with students, and he liked to party. So nobody's ever been certain how he got in there the first time, but he definitely met Amanda Knox downstairs, and he also met Meredith Kercher. They were all down there smoking hash one night.
Now, give us a little bit of the background of Rudy Gaudet, and also that first encounter, according to witnesses. Was he attracted to either one of? Was he attracted to Amanda, or was he attracted to Meredith? What did you discover?
Well, he wrote something after he'd been arrested in prison. He wrote that he had noticed Amanda in the room when they were all sitting. The guys were all sitting around smoking hash, and then she walked in, and they had been talking about how pretty she was, and then she walked in, and he was admiring her, and then later Meredith came in, and he wrote he couldn't believe that there was one that was even prettier than the other walked in the door. And they were attractive girls.
Right. Now, let's talk about the day in question. You talk about, according to the witnesses later, after Amanda is arrested, that there seemed to be some drift, that the relationship was not the same as it had started, and it seemed to start famously, them going out to clubs and smoking weed and getting high and partying a little bit. From everything you found out, what was the problem? Was there any strain on the relationship after a certain amount of time, and what was that attributed to?
Well, Amanda Knox would say that they didn't have any strain. What happened was the British girls who were friends of Meredith, after Amanda Knox was arrested, they were questioned. Everyone was questioned right after the body was found. And nobody said Amanda Knox was weird, or nobody singled her out. 4 nights later, the police arrested Amanda Knox and her boyfriend for this murder. They decided that Amanda Knox had been leading these 2 men, this guy Patrick Lumumba, and who's totally innocent, and Solecito, her boyfriend, in a sex game gone wrong. Somebody was playing with a knife. They were trying to get Meredith to take her clothes off or something, and she wouldn't because she was such a good girl, and Amanda stuck a knife in her throat. And once they had this theory out there, they then went back and re-interviewed all of these people who they had interviewed before, and in the course of the questioning, you can see them asking, well, was Amanda weird? Did they get along? Did they, And the British girls who were friends with Meredith started to say things like, well, you know what? She was really weird. She used to burst into song for no reason, try to get attention to herself. Meredith was uncomfortable with her because she had a vibrator in a plastic see-through case in the bathroom that they shared. She didn't know how to clean the toilet because these European toilets are different. You have to clean them all the time. She never did that, so she was unhygienic. And she brought strange men home, and Meredith felt uncomfortable with that. So they sounded like they were starting to rub up against each other the wrong way, as girls will do at that age. And the British girls, shared this with the police, and the police used it as ammunition for their theory, which was, Amanda Knox really hated Meredith. There was some tension, and she wanted to kill her. So that's the story of that.
Now, you talk about the theory that they went in and tried to make the evidence fit that notion or that theory. Can you tell us what you believe, where they've got this theory? It certainly didn't come from very much evidence. So culturally, how do you explain this theory of this American woman being involved in this sex game? Yeah.
Well, there were a number of things going on. The first thing is the prosecutor, who is also tasked with investigating a crime under their judicial system.
Right.
The small-town prosecutor, he's never lived outside of Perugia, almost never. I mean, he's lived out for 1 year in another Etruscan town, but he's grown up there. He's obsessed with the signs and symbols of his Catholic history and the history of the town. He is a pretty staunch believer in the notion that there are evil manifested on the planet, on Earth, that Satan is, that there's a battle between good and evil, it's biblical, and that he's, Satan walks on Earth. And he also believes that people in his community are involved in secret cult-like behavior, worshiping the devil. And, I don't know if that's true, but I wouldn't put it past the people in that community because it's a strange place. And I'm not going to say that he's, insane. Like some Americans say that he's insane. I feel that there are people who maybe are doing that there. It's the flip side of hardcore Catholicism. And it's also, Italy is a Dionysian country, and it's got this pagan underpinning. Anyway, and so in his world, the pagan versus the Catholic is, really still part of everyday life. And so he looked at this girl, and she's doing things in the police station. Before they arrest her, she was doing things like making out with the boyfriend. She's not giving them a straight story about where she was the night of the murder. She seems shifty. She seems overly enthusiastic about strange things. She's not bursting into tears like a normal Italian grieving girl would be over a roommate. She seems, in fact, unconcerned or stoic. What we would say stoic, but they would say, cold. And he didn't like this. So then he also is familiar with the notion that, in his community, most of the crimes are caused by foreigners. In his mind, that's who the crimes are committed by. And so first thing he wanted was a foreigner. He thought that somebody from out of the country a foreign man had done this. And she had on her cell phone the last call before she mysteriously turned her phone off at around 8:30 or 9 o'clock on the murder night. The last thing that was there was a text message saying, "See you later," to this guy named Patrick Lumumba in Italian, "Ci vediamo, I'll see you later." And he was her boss at the bar where she worked. She cleaned tables at a bar. And he's this African guy, so he fits this profile. And here's this message, text message, "Ci vediamo," and it means "I'll see you later." Well, in English, when you say "see you later," it means bye, goodbye. When you say "see you later" in Italian, "ci vediamo," it literally means "I will see you later," like in 5 minutes. So the police have this text message, and they've got her phone, and they've got her in one room, and they've got the boyfriend in the other, and they've probably been smoking pot that night, and they brought him in, it's 10 at night, and they get the boyfriend to say, well, I really don't know if she was there all night. They've been saying all week, we were just asleep in our beds, we smoked dope, we went to sleep. But now they're getting the boyfriend to say, well, I can't attest that she was there, probably because they said, you were asleep, so how can you know she didn't get up?
Right.
Anyway, he says she's not there. They go back to her, and they hold the phone up, and they're screaming at her, going, what did you say you were going to see Patrick later? We know you were in the house. Was he there with you? You must tell us. And they started just screaming at her, according to her, and she broke down and said, yes, I see him in my vision. I see him now. I shut my eyes, and I can see him in my house, and I can hear Meredith's screams. And she broke down and started crying, and she wrote this statement that said, I'm not sure if this is true. It's a vision, but it's the best I can do. I see him in the house. I see him going into the room, and I hear Meredith screaming. That was enough to have her arrested, and to arrest the boyfriend, and to go and arrest this poor guy, Patrick Lumumba, who had an airtight alibi, which was found out 2 weeks later he was absolutely not there. And they throw these people in jail, these 3 kids, and they announced, and they had to get this crime solved, because the students were fleeing Perugia. It's a student town, and they don't like, there's a murder of a student. This is very unusual. So the police really wanted to get this thing solved. So they solved the crime, and then the prosecutor pulls in this sex game theory. Why did he do it? Well, I think because he's thinking he sees some kind of ritualistic signs on the crime scene. It was a weird crime scene. It was in the house. The girl's door was locked. The bedroom door was locked. There was one bloody footprint, one shoe in blood going out the door, in lighter and lighter print. One shoe, not 2 feet, 1 foot, as though somebody was jumping out the door on 1 foot, bloody foot. There was a broken window with no human traces that the police could find on it. In another room, there was rummaged up stuff in that room, but the rest of the house looked untouched. And it happened on a Thursday night, the night after Halloween, which was All Saints' Day. All Souls' Night is what it was, when the dead mingle with the living, historically,
wow.
all the way back to pagan times, okay? And he knows this. I mean, he knows that this is a holy day for Italian Catholics. They all go to the cemeteries. The families go to the cemeteries. And it's also a dark day. It has, dark connotations. And the one footprint going out the door is symbolic in pagan ritual of various sort of bloody rites that were, pagan rites, or people would maybe sacrifice an animal or something. They would take a shoe off, and they don't even really know why, but there are all these statues and there are references to it, and it kind of is, it carries on in the Achilles heel, the wounded foot, or the Cinderella losing the shoe. They don't really know, anthropologists and historians, they don't really know what it meant, but it had to do with some pagan rite. And so he knows that stuff too. I'm sure he does. And during the Inquisition, when witches were interrogated, they would say, we followed a white lady of the game out to the forest. We would fly through walls at night and find ourselves in the forest, and we would fly back into people's homes, and we would drink the wine and go to the bathroom in their pots. Well, there was feces left in one of the toilets by the killer. And the window's open, no human signs of how, it's broken window, no human signs of how they'd gotten in. The one bloody footprint going out the door. Oh, and they always had their game nights, these witches, in the Inquisition. Italian witches would say the game nights were on Thursdays. Again, nobody knows why they were Thursdays. And so here he had this white goddess witch person who literally looks exactly like the town Madonna. Her face could have been the model for the Madonna, which is the painting, the icon that all these churches, each town has its own Madonna that people bring ex voto objects to worship. And she is Amanda Knox is like her twin. So here he is. He's a man who's worshipped this Madonna forever, and here he has this sort of uncanny resembling girl in front of him, who seems to be unable to explain what she was doing on this bloody night, and whose behavior was very strange, and he just put 2 and 2 together and came up with a theory.
Now you have this, it almost sounds like textbook false confession when you have the way she responded, with the vision. I mean, I've actually... Yeah, I mean, I haven't even given you the whole story, because the way the confession went down was she, couldn't speak Italian very well, so they had brought in a translator from a housewife who occasionally worked with the Perugia police. Wow. Was
brought in, and she was in the middle of the night, and she was speaking English to her while the police were yelling at her in Italian. And she was translating, but then she leaned over to her. This is classic. This is one of there's a 3-step interrogation method that's used in America, and it's also used there apparently, which is first you get them confused, then you tell them that you have some evidence that they are part of the crime, and then you introduce the element of memory loss or psychological trauma. And what they did, they had already gotten her to this point where they were saying, we know you were in the house, we know you were in the house. Then the translator, who's like the good cop, leans over in English and says, look, you must try to remember. When I was, let me share a story with you. When I was in a car accident not long ago, or some years back, I broke my leg, and I don't remember it happening. And she said that was because it was traumatic, and you've obviously suffered a great trauma. And so I think you should try to remember what happened. You should work on your memory.
Sure.
And try to envision something. And Amanda Knox, who's this, she's been a writer since she was 8 years old. She thinks of herself as a writer. She's creative. She's suggestible. She's on her junior year abroad. This horrible thing has happened in her house, and she's basically in this kind of bubble of unreality anyway, as these kids are when they're in a foreign country like that, at the age of 20, smoking hash, and I think she just made up a story for them.
Now
she thought it was true. I mean, she imagined it. She has a good imagination.
Right. Now, you talk about that she had always fashioned herself as being a writer and wanted to be a creative writer, but she had also journaled obsessively for years, and so that continued while she was incarcerated, and that plays into this story as well. Tell us what happens after this. Obviously, she has to speak to a lawyer, but it may be difficult because she's in Italy. What happens in terms of her? What do her parents do in terms of securing a lawyer for her, and how does that work for her, and who does she get? What happens after this?
Well, so she gets arrested, and the police knew that her mother was coming. The parents have been calling, saying, you should probably go leave the country. And Amanda said, no, I want to help the police. I'm going to help the police. I keep going in and helping them. They need me to help them figure out what happened. So she was willingly going in, and so she was in there and arrested, and they knew the mother was coming because they'd been wiretapping all the phones, and they knew the mom was coming that night, was coming the next day. So they basically had to put her in jail because the mother was going to probably whisk her off to, the embassy or out of the country. So they had her in jail, and the mom arrived. Mom arrived, and the stepdad. The mom arrived, learned on television, through television, and in the airport that her daughter had been arrested.
Wow.
And she was freaking out. She called her husband. The stepdad called the embassy, and the embassy said, "Here's a list of lawyers." That's all they could do. They emailed him a list of lawyers. And he went down the list with his finger, and he phoned one after another until he got one that answered the phone in English.
Wow.
And that's who he chose. Whose secretary answered the phone in English. That's who it was. Wow. And that's who he chose. He did no due diligence at all. He just picked the first guy who spoke English, who happened to be a corporate lawyer who's done free market business law in Bulgaria, and nice guy, but never had done a criminal case in Italy, and that's who they got. And he's not the kind of lawyer who was equipped, I think, to come out with his fists up, and that's what you had to do because the prosecution was pretty married to this theory. But the other thing that was going on is it wasn't just the lawyers, it's the media, because, this is now an international story. I mean, it was first the British girls, the British tabloids are there, and then now it's the American girl is leading a sex game with a knife. So, it's a sensational case. Beautiful girl turns into a Charlie Manson. So you've got tabloids from the UK, you've got the American press, and you've got hundreds of Italian TV cameras in that town, and they couldn't back off the theory. And so what happened was they present this theory. Now the reporters are all over it, and they then a week later, all the forensic evidence science starts to come back from the room. The fingerprints, And the blood, the DNA, all of it belongs to somebody else, not any of the 3 people they have in jail. And it belongs to this guy named Rudy Gay, who they happen to have record of. They have his fingerprints on file because he's an immigrant's son. And in Italy, even if you're a little kid when you arrive there, you are still your entire life just a guest. You're never going to be an Italian. And they had fingerprinted every year. And they knew who he was. And they knew who his friends were. He's a Perugia, lifelong Perugian. So they called some of his friends. They had the friends Skype him. And they caught him. They found out he was hiding in Germany, and they got him. And they arrested him. And then he got, first thing he said in his Skype conversation was to his friend, I was there. Yes, I was in the room. Meredith invited me in. I went to the bathroom. When I came out, she was bleeding on the floor. And I saw an Italian man running by saying, black man found, black man convicted. I knew if I stayed there and called the police, I would get blamed, so I ran away. And then the friend said, well, did Amanda have anything to do with it? Because, of course, now it's all over TV in Europe. And he's watching it from his hostel. And he says, no, she had nothing to do with it. It's his first statement. Then his Perugia lawyers show up. He gets lawyered up. And the Perugia lawyers get him to start saying different things. And then pretty soon Amanda Knox was there. Amanda Knox was arguing with Meredith about money. Amanda Knox was outside the door. He puts her in different ways over time. And he was convicted separately. Very quickly, he went to jail and in a separate trial because he had no money for a lawyer, so he's an indigent. And he was tried separately. So these 2 kids had to, fight this case, this theory, this narrative that had been presented by themselves with Amanda's lawyer, who was not a very good criminal lawyer. Raffaele's lawyer was good, but I watched the trial, and by the end of the trial, the good lawyer was making a lot of sense, and they poked a lot of holes in the prosecution's case because the prosecution didn't really have any plausible material evidence to connect them to the room where the murder happened, and they were saying that the broken window in the room that was all rummaged through was a setup, a staged robbery. When in fact everybody knew that Rudy Gay had been in the month before the murder had been committing break-ins, at least one of them involving climbing in a second-floor window and stealing stuff. And he was broke. He had been arrested the weekend before in Milan with stolen goods from a burgled Perugia law office the week before. So that's 2 events that he's associated with. We know of 2 more that he was associated with. I uncovered in my investigation. But nobody really cared about him because he's in Italy. If you're black, you're invisible. Right. Europeans like to say Americans are so racist. I mean, they may not say it so much now that Obama's been elected, but they like to say America's racist, and because you know why? They've watched TV, they know about slavery, they've watched MLK assassination, they've watched, dogs being put on people in Washington, civil rights marches, and yet they don't look in the mirror and say, well, what do we do with our brown-skinned? These are homogeneous countries. We are a heterogeneous society. They're homogeneous countries. So when somebody like Rudy Gay's dad arrives, and Gay himself, they're invisible. They are not assimilated. There's 1 black parliamentarian out of 600 in Italy. So in any case, what you had was this amazing story with a beautiful woman, beautiful photogenic woman. Italians obsessed with her because she fits this sort of image that they have of beautiful, evil girl, sex obsessed, the nymphomaniac who's a killer, the good and evil, the Madonna and the whore, and they couldn't take their eyes off her. And the rest of the media, and I fault them very much, the Americans and the British, who do have a tradition of investigative journalism, whereas the Italians don't, didn't even bother to go and find out anything about this guy.
Yeah.
They just let the story kind of float out there, and went with it. The tabloids loved it. The Brits, they stirred the pot. They ran those headlines, the Foxy Knoxy headlines. They cherry-picked through the diaries, the writings. They found all the things that they could present that were, inculpatory, and ignored mountains of exculpatory information about her. Just ignored it completely. And so really that's how it played out.
Now, one thing I found confusing maybe for the audience would be that if Rudy Gaudet, and maybe you can expand on this a little bit, why you think the lawyers would want him to admit that Amanda was there when he originally changed his story to include that Amanda was there. But if he said that Amanda and Meredith were arguing over money, then how do the tabloids and the media still continue with the sex party story? Is it that, is it that interesting to them?
It's that interesting, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, I really think that you could see that they cherry-picked what they wanted to report. And, of course, they assumed that Rudy was lying. I mean, which he is, I think. He definitely was not invited into the house. Nobody who knew Meredith thought that she had anything to do with him, and would have invited him into the house at night. She didn't indicate that she had a date with him. She never indicated that she knew him. She had a boyfriend downstairs who was away. The house was empty because it was All Souls weekend, and all these kids, the Italians, take it seriously, and they go home and go to church. So yeah, the press didn't believe him at all, and they picked through what they wanted to believe. So they didn't believe that he was there as an invited guest of Meredith, but they would believe that when he said she was there outside the room, or that she was taking money. Oh, and the other thing is that Meredith's money had been taken, right, and her phones. She was dead in her room, and her purse was on the bed, and Rudy Gaudet's fingerprints are inside the purse. $400 that she had for rent money that she was going to give to her roommates on Monday was gone, and her cell phones were found in a yard down the road from the house. Somebody had flung them over this hedge.
Now, you prominently tell the story of, we already talked about Magistrate Mignini and his belief that in all things evil and good, and that the powers of evil were present and very forceful and present in this story. But you claimed that Mignini did something that contravened his job completely, and maybe tell us about that and his changing of the hour of death to fit his theory.
Oh yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there were a lot of things. I mean, they play fast and loose with the facts there. That you notice right away. The journalists will print whatever the lawyers tell them. The judiciary does not have a public face, so they're not accountable. If they say something, you can't pin it to one person. He would say, in the beginning of the trial, they had a time of death that the coroner had given them. He treated that as like a window. And when one of his witnesses, this serial witness heroin addict that he had used in other murder cases in town, this guy got up and said he thought he saw the students above the house in this basketball court the night of the murder around 11:30. He then moved the time of death from 9:30 to 11:30, so that and his closing arguments were different from his opening arguments, which right there is not the way things are done here.
So
I'm going to have to.
Overall, we're not going to be able to go through the whole trial, but overall, where do you see?
We have 1 minute left.
Oh, we've got a couple minutes. We can go a little bit longer. This really necessitates it anyway. But if you can hang around for a few more minutes, I'd like to just explain a little bit more. Maybe you can tell us where are the key points. You attended the trial. Where are the key points that you found that the prosecution failed in its honest prosecution of this. You talk about one here moving the time of death a couple hours, and then getting the witness that he's used before to say that he thought he saw this.
Well, the main way that they failed is that they presented two pieces of evidence that supposedly link the students to the murder room. One is a bra clasp that was torn off the dead girl's body,
right,
that they collected 6 weeks after the murder CSI investigation was completed, when they figured out that the bloody footprint was Gate A's shoe and not Raffaelle's shoe. They then came forward with this bra clasp, and they said, hey, we've got DNA of Raffaelle on this bra clasp. Tiny little, piece of metal, and this invisible stuff that supposedly links to him. And then they came forward with a knife that they had pulled out of a drawer in his house, and they said, oh, our scientists found traces of Meredith on the blade and traces of Amanda on the handle. DNA traces, okay, invisible DNA traces. And they basically treated this as like the Holy Eucharist, this stuff. I mean, it didn't matter that that international scientists said whatever they did in that lab was not up to international standards, because the amount of whatever the substance was so tiny that the call was subjective. They couldn't.
Right.
It couldn't be. It would not have been allowed into courts in the U.S. or the U.K. Whatever this was. They then went back in an appeal, and the defense said, we want independent experts to look at this, and they refused. In the appeal, they brought an independent expert in who listed off 54 ways that the police scientists had screwed up these tests, and completely threw it out. Said it's contamination. The bra clasp, if it's anything, it's contamination. The material on the knife is potato starch, which they were calling Meredith's body, DNA. But they showed 54 reasons why it was not done right, and it's thrown out. So they utterly failed at that, and they failed because they knew already in the very beginning. The scientist had written on this woman who had done the first test had written in English on the documents that she was working with, low copy number. In English, apparently that's the lingua franca of DNA testing. And low copy number simply means it's too small an amount for our machines to definitively explain who it belongs to
right,
identify it. And so, that therefore indicates that she made a subjective call. Now, some people, like the Americans, like to say, or the Knox friends like to say, well, it was a deliberate, scheme to implicate. Once the prosecutor had them, the police scientist went with it. But more likely, what happens is, and it's happened here, I talk to criminologists, it happens here all the time, when you have a confession, which is what they had the
right,
vision statement. When you have a confession, everything from the scientific material stuff to the witness statements, everything will point towards that person. It's sort of like the playing field tilts and all the marbles just roll down that one side. And so there's no longer any objectivity, and it happens to scientists as much as it happens to the British girls who they were interviewing. That she decided, I see this, and she saw it. And that's why I say it's like the Eucharist. It became a matter of, the DNA became a matter of faith. You believed it or you didn't. It wasn't
right,
science anymore. That's for the jurors, for sure, because nobody could understand what it was. Even we couldn't, we're not scientists. We're sitting there listening to them argue about these alleles and these picograms of,
sure,
the language isn't even the language we speak.
right,
And we were listening, hearing this, and the jurors, for sure. It's like, you believe it or you don't.
Mm-hmm. You also talk about another important thing, too, that we know here in Canada and the U.S. about the voir dire, that it's very important, especially to when you're selecting jurors and rejecting jurors, to try to get the kind of jury that you want. And apparently,
they
explain what the difference is.
They randomly pick them out of a hat. nobody gets to challenge, and they're never sequestered.
Incredible.
So they can believe whatever they want to believe. They're not asked whether they know anything about the case, and they go home every night and read the newspapers.
Yeah, in this case, that's very, very damaging given what's in the media about this case.
Yeah, because they were taking pictures. Yeah, they were running, re-looping and re-looping in the video of her kissing the boyfriend in front of the house after the murder. And, when the CSI guys were still going in and out, they were out there kissing. And they re-looped that so it looked like they were making out. I mean, who knows? They may have just pecked each other once. But if you re-loop that enough, it looks like they're, making out. So, anyway, Dan, I am going to have to go because I have to get up and do another radio interview tomorrow. This is a very busy time because you know that the appeal is about to end, and within 2 days they're either going to walk out the door or they're going to have to be sent. They're going to go back to jail, and the dungeon doors will really stay shut. And I have an early call tomorrow, and it is 10:05.
Well, I want to thank you very much for this hour and 5 minutes, especially. Thank you very much for...
I thank you.
It was an incredible read. It's an incredible book, and you have been a great interview explaining just a small portion of what is contained in this book, which is, like I say, it's a very, very good book, an incredible story, and you've done a comprehensive, it's incredible, the background, the context, everything that you have, and the loads and scads of interviews that you've done with every single important player in this story. So kudos to you for this great job.
Well, tell your listeners my name is NinaBurleigh, Nina Burleigh, and you can go to ninaburleigh.com and you can read more about the case and more about what's happening. And I'm also on Facebook, and so I encourage them to do that because it's an unfolding story as well. And it definitely is not a 30-second soundbite. It definitely can't be explained even in an hour. It deserves a read.
Yes, and it's amazing too that this story is in the news, and we're getting the privilege of having your book and this interview right now for people to more understand, despite what the media has the coverage of from the media.
It's well timed. Well timed. Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and have a very good evening, Nina. Thank you very much.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about it, with my special guest, Nina Burleigh, A Fatal Gift of Beauty, The Trials of Amanda Knox. Just tune into news, CNN, everywhere in America and the world. The appeal is going on and being discussed right now. And again, visit Nina Burleigh, Burleigh, her website, or Facebook her and become a fan. So thank you and good night.